Hello, friends. Welcome back. I'm Brad Wetzler, and this is the Enlightened-ishe podcast. This week, I want to build on or unpack the life lessons I learned during my pilgrimage to Arunachala, the great Shiva mountain in southern India, a trip that I embarked on a few years ago. But first, I want to talk about a couple of words. The first word is spiritual. I use this word a lot in this podcast, but I want to talk about what I mean by that word. To me, spiritual is nearly synonymous with inner life. I do happen to think there is an energetic force in the universe, and I sometimes say the word God, but really for me, the spiritual is the vast landscape of our consciousness, made up of our minds, our emotions, our heart. It's about how we think, feel, and move through the world. It's life, and it's mysterious. Of course, I believe in science, but I also know, and Einstein spoke of this, that our human brains cannot scientifically understand it all, or at least we haven't yet by a long shot. So spiritual is mystery too. So if you're turned off by the word spiritual, and some of my listeners have told me that they are, then just go with inner life, or just life, or mystery. The second word I want to talk about is faith, because that's what today's podcast is about. Faith, and, well, secondarily, humiliation. That's right. We're going to dive deep into the positive aspects of being humiliated. Humiliation as a path towards spiritual and personal growth. Because, well, humiliation, man, there's opportunity there, spiritual gifts there. But back to faith. Faith is a hard word, and I think it confuses people. Before the age of science and reason, faith meant something different than it does today. Today, faith and belief have grown to mean nearly the same thing. If you say, I have faith in God, it's as if you are asserting that you believe in God and that God exists definitely, and he has the qualities of God that we all recognize as God. And if you're a fundamentalist Christian, that might in fact be your stance. But faith didn't always have this sense of certainty to it. Before the Enlightenment, faith just wasn't so cut and dry. You could have faith in God, and you could be riddled with doubt. Before this change in language, before science, if you said, I have faith in God, it only meant that you held God in your heart. You valued godness. You steeped in godness. There was room for error, though. It's a subtle difference, but it's important. And a lot of theologians believe that this linguistic shift is partly responsible for why we as a culture become so focused on materialism and so unfocused on life's more mysterious aspects. There just are certain things in our life that are unknowable, unfathomable, mysterious. But just because something is mysterious doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Do I believe in God? I don't know. I don't have certainty about that, but I do have faith in many things greater than myself. I can trust in the mystery of life, the universe, maybe God. Well, that's my linguistics lesson for today. With this, I want to talk about a different kind of faith, faith in oneself. I want to talk about how I rediscovered faith in myself. And maybe it will speak to you. Maybe you will find something in this talk that will guide you back to having more faith in yourself if you've lost it. That's my wish, and that's my prayer. Let's begin with a quick thumbnail of the story I told a few weeks ago in the Adventures in Faith episode. It was about my pilgrimage to Arunachala. The year before I traveled back to India was a big one for me. I was trying to build my coaching business, but it hadn't yet taken off. My client list was small, and I was making ends meet by, You guessed it, driving for ride services such as Uber and Lyft. I was also super devoted to my spiritual life and practices. This was my daily schedule. Wake up at 4:30 a.m., meditate, practice yoga, read the Bhagavad Gita, journal. My morning spiritual routine lasted 3 hours, sometimes longer. Then I walked my dog, ate breakfast, and did my editing and coaching work. I would see friends, and often then I went to a second yoga class later in the day. And then after dinner, I drove Uber. I drove passengers to the Denver airport, and late at night, I drove college kids to bars. I'd stop driving at midnight, go to bed, and then at 4:30 a.m., do it all over again. I was physically and emotionally and spiritually healthier than I'd ever been. All this yoga was helping me get back into my body, and meditation was helping to create a sense of home in my mind. Reading about yoga was giving me a new ethical framework for my life. I was trying to practice the yamas and the niyamas, such as non-harming of self and others. And all this yoga and meditation was also lighting a fire inside me to travel to India again. The first time I traveled to India was 1999. I was on a journalism assignment for Wired magazine to write about the cultural shifts that the tech boom in India was bringing to life. After I finished my reporting work, I traveled to Delhi and Varanasi. And well, Varanasi blew my mind. By 1999, I'd traveled to many places around the world as a traveling adventure journalist. But Varanasi was different and special. It was an ancient city, one of the world's most ancient. At that time, I'd been practicing yoga for about 5 years, but it was more or less a stretching exercise to me back then. I hadn't yet gone deeper into the philosophy and practice of yoga, but I was interested in spiritual things. I always had been, even if I didn't have a spiritual life at this time. On that trip in 1999, I hired a boat to take me up the Ganges to the burning ghats. There, I stood in smoke and watched bodies burn. Afterward, I entered a Shiva temple filled with chanting sadhus or holy men. I was curious about these men and moved by their faith. Sadhus renounce the world and devote themselves to Shiva. I never forgot the scene in that dark, candlelit temple. The muttering sadhus, they seemed both crazy, and at the same time, I admired them, the purity of their faith. Well, flash forward to 2018, and after a few years of these intense spiritual practices, I craved returning to India. I signed up for a retreat in the northern Himalayas. My life was on an upswing. It was improving after a period in my late 30s and early 40s when depression visited, and seeking the help of a psychiatrist, I began taking a big cocktail of medications: antidepressants, mood stabilizers, antipsychotics, stimulants, benzodiazepines, and more. I took so many medications, I was so numbed out, I barely left my house for 5 years. I stumbled when I walk. I couldn't ride a bike. Most days, I simply stumbled down to a nearby cafe and tried to read the magazines that I once had cover stories in. So when I was traveling back to India, I was still a little bit confused and spun out by what had happened to me. How had my career as an adventure writer and journalist gotten so derailed? Why had depression been such a constant force in my life since I was a teen? Of course, I'd been in therapy and I'd been uncovering some of the things that had happened in my childhood. I had grown up in a family that struggled with alcohol addiction, narcissism, and denial. I don't say these things to accuse anybody. I say these things because I was a child and my sense of reality was warped by the denial that my family had lived in. I had learned to doubt my own self. In fact, I suspect I had a very underdeveloped self when I left home at 18. I was blown around by the winds of my emotions and lacked a solidness that most people associate with a healthy ego, a healthy sense of self. Point of clarity. I chose to take all those pills. Of course, I'm angry at the psychiatrist as well. He thought he knew what he was doing. No, he was convinced he knew what he was doing when he didn't. At times, I was so numbed out that I wanted to shoot myself. The side effect turned out to be as dangerous and debilitating as the depression was. Thank God I said no when the psychiatrist asked me if I wanted to try electroconvulsive therapy. I hope that nobody ever has to go through what I went through with the extreme levels of over-medication. I hope the psychiatric industry wakes up to trauma and sees how their practice of over-medicating patients with these cocktails is ruining people's lives and making healing from trauma harder, not easier. I have immense empathy for anyone who is feeling too numbed out to face the day today. I'm still trying to forgive the doctor who treated me. I'm still trying to forgive myself for poisoning myself with his pills. But forgiveness takes time. If I don't get there in this lifetime, maybe I will in the next. So during this period, I was getting ready to travel to India. I was involved with trying to build more self. And at the same time I was trying to build more self, I was confused and befuddled by the teachings of yoga, which I was trying to embrace, that we needed to let go of the past, let go of our past sufferings, let go of the stories, Brad, some teachers said to me, as I told and retold the story of how depression had begun visiting me at age 13. And I talked about the events of my childhood. Yoga teachers and spiritual teachers would simply say, just lose the stories, Brad. And I was trying to. I was. One of the central tenets of yoga and most Eastern wisdom is that liberation can be achieved by bringing our attention to this moment and letting go of the stories of the past. When we fully inhabit this moment, the past recedes. The future is inconsequential. I kept trying to embrace this teaching. It did and still does seem wise. But when you have trauma, the feelings and stories associated with traumatic events and periods of our lives are extremely vivid and alive. During a flashback, the past feels alive in your body right now. Moreover, another symptom of trauma is that the things and people who traumatized you become obsessions. They take on larger than life qualities. You can't just tell yourself to lose the old stories and expect them to disappear from your mind and brain. I've learned that recovery is a time-consuming, painstaking process. Tears must be shed, and hurrying the process can lead to being further re-traumatized. Well, in 2018, when I landed back in India, I was not expecting what would happen. The group I was traveling with stayed at an ashram near the temple that was home to Neem Karoli Baba, the famous blanketed avuncular guru of Ram Das, Krishna Das, and other Americans in the 1960s and 1970s. While there, I and a few friends visited a 100-year-old yogi in a cave. This yogi slapped me gently on the head, sending me into a flood of tears. The next day, I fell into a 12-hour mystical experience that rivaled any psychedelic experience I'd ever had. And this was without drugs. When I returned home to Boulder, Colorado, where I lived, I couldn't shake the memories of the yogi in the cave or the mystical experience. It was too much, and my psyche felt overwhelmed. I talked about these events all the time with friends and my girlfriend, with tears welling up in my eyes. Eventually, my girlfriend left. We weren't getting along anyway, so it was probably a blessing, but it hurt. It hurt bad. And then I wrecked my car, so I couldn't drive Uber anymore. Around that time, my friend Matthew, a great yoga teacher in Amherst, Massachusetts, who'd led the trip to the Himalayas in the previous fall, invited me back with him and some other people. This time they were going to southern India. Matthew said, "I can see you on the Shiva mountain, Brad. I think your soul is being birthed. You should do this." And so in February 2019, I flew back to India and I prepared for the traditional pilgrimage around Arunachala. The night before, a lot of emotion rose up inside me. What was this emotion about? I had been seeking answers in external things my entire life. I'd been seeking happiness in external things too. Adventure, drugs, women, sex, meaning. Lately, I'd been seeking answers and meaning in yoga and meditation and self-help books. They had become my addictions, my most recent addictions. And I was tired of it all. I was tired of the seeking. I wanted to stop. And so, in the middle of the night, I said a prayer to Shiva. Break me down to my core. Destroy me. Hey, you God of destruction, if you're so powerful, obliterate me because I can't stand myself anymore. I really wanted that. I was sick of me. I was sick of my bullshit. I wanted to rebuild myself from the bottom up. As I hiked around Arunachala, gazing up at the conical mountain, I chanted, Om Namah Shivaya. It sounded like this. Om Namah Shivaya. As I walked, I kept thinking about a quote from an Indian sage that I'd read in a book. Go ahead, light your candles and burn your incense and ring your bells and call out to God. But watch out, because God will come and he will put you on his anvil and beat you and beat you and beat you until he turns brass into pure gold. As I rounded the last curve, dodging rickshaws, cows, and cars, I began to feel a flood of tears welling up inside me. When I reached the end of the walk, at the gates of Ramana Maharshi Ashram, I collapsed, crying, and I couldn't stop. Today, when I think back on myself, sitting on the ground at the ashram, my hands covering my face in tears, I think of a quote from Joseph Campbell. It is by going down into the abyss that we recover the treasures of life. Where you stumble, there lies your treasure. I cried on the 4-hour bus ride back to where we were staying. I'm being real here. My friends Brenda and Tim had to literally walk me to bed that night, tuck me in. 3 days later, I wept the entire plane ride across the Atlantic. What had happened to me on Arunachala? It was hard. It was one of the hardest weeks of my life, that trip to India in some ways. But I knew it was a good thing. What had happened? I was brought utterly to my knees. I was humiliated. One of my favorite spiritual teachers, Richard Rohr, says that he prays for one good humiliation a day. And that's what keeps him in touch with his true self. It keeps him from getting full of himself. You know, we live in a very narcissistic time in which we all puff up our own self-importance. We puff up our importance on social media with careers and titles. Jesus, our political leaders are the biggest narcissists of all. Big, fragile egos in Washington, D.C. Well, on Arunachala, I got what I asked for. My ego was shattered. I asked for destruction of my bullshit, and that's exactly what happened. I was humiliated. I saw that I wasn't what I thought I was. I had spent decades trying to become somebody, trying to be somebody. I'd wanted to become a successful, famous writer. And a lot of this running, it was a strategy to avoid feelings I couldn't deal with, feelings of worthlessness. I was running away from depression, which was visiting me with deep, long episodes. I had spent decades running from depression. I had spent decades people pleasing. I had all these strategies for how to get by in life. I ran from myself by traveling, by taking drugs. I ran toward things, people, women, relationships, sex. I ran away from things, sometimes the same women. I was simultaneously running away from myself and running toward all sorts of things in the external world. That day on Arunachala, I cut through all my own bullshit, or a lot of it. I couldn't prop up my own ego anymore. I couldn't avoid myself anymore. I couldn't strategize and run away and toward anymore. I had to face myself and confront myself, my flaws, all of them, my true self, maybe for the very first time. And it wasn't pretty. At the same time, it was pretty because, when you strip away your ego, you get to something real and essential. Psychologists sometimes call it the true self. Spiritual people call it your soul. I saw my soul. When I got home from India in Boulder, Colorado, I settled into my routine of driving Uber, editing books. And at the time I was teaching yoga in the park, and I began to face some other things in my life. I had finally had the humility to look at myself and face what was the biggest challenge I had. That I didn't have faith in myself. I didn't love myself. Not only that, I was pretty brutal to myself. Eventually, I got a new car, and one night I drove Lyft into the early morning hours. I was driving people to bars, and I always made them sing devotional songs with me. It's funny to remember this. But when I got home, I started beating myself up. I'd allowed my bank account to get so low I barely had any money left. I'd spent it all on trips to India, on yoga teacher trainings and such. I went to bed, and there I just kept beating myself up. I'd also just received a diagnosis of trauma and PTSD from my doctor. And my therapist at that time had advised me to do one thing. Brad, she said, you've got to turn your life into yoga. That's the only path forward for you. My therapist wasn't talking about doing yoga postures 24/7. She was talking about adopting practices that would bring me back to myself and doing them as often as I could. For example, on nights when I would get lonely, she advised me to squat in my room and feel my body. Feel my feet against the ground, the life in my hips. There were some nights this practice actually kept me alive. She also said that metta meditation could help soften my inner critic. It was a brutal inner critic, a classic symptom of childhood trauma. My inner critic was so brutal that I could get triggered into a trauma flashback just by thinking and telling myself what a shithead I was. Inner critics can be powerful and destructive forces in our lives. The voice says that we are not good enough, that we are flawed, and that we have little to offer. What will they think, this voice asks? Allowing the inner critic to have a strong voice can keep us from happiness and reaching our dreams and our potential. We may be so accustomed to the inner critic in our minds, they become the soundtrack to our lives, the soundtrack of worry and doubt. It permeates our daily existence and keeps us locked in shackles, and we don't even notice it's happening. Meanwhile, metta meditation, also known as loving-kindness meditation, is a type of meditation described and taught by the historical Buddha. It's said that nuns and monks sent to meditate in the jungle became so scared of the darkness and the noises and the lions and tigers and bears that they scurried back to the Buddha, too overwhelmed with terror to continue. The Buddha prescribed metta meditation as an antidote to fear. Many of our conditioned and instantaneous responses are based on fear. Defensiveness and worry are both rooted in it. Practicing metta helps us rewire our patterns to create responses which are less fearful and more open and receptive to our experiences. It doesn't mean that we won't have anxiety and worry anymore if you do a lot of metta, but it does mean that we don't have to lead with it. A typical metta meditation goes something like this. You recite these words: may I be filled with loving kindness. May I be healthy in body and mind. May I be peaceful, happy, and free. And you do this for yourself. You do this for a friend. You do this for an enemy. And you then also do this for all beings. Well, I decided that night that I would do 30 minutes of meditation, metta meditation, twice every day. I have an addictive personality after all, so I decided to go for it. And I did. I followed through with it. And I've been doing metta meditation twice a day for 4 years now. I think I've done something like 1,200 hours of metta meditation since 2018. The first time I tried it, I had doubts. Really? I was so used to being prescribed pills for things that were wrong with me. Really? Reciting words can heal me? The second time I tried metta meditation, I still had doubts, but I began to settle into the practice. And by the end of the first week, I found that I was starting to maybe feel better. By 3 months, I could swear I was feeling better. Maybe I could feel my brain rewiring, kind of new grooves, positive grooves. It happened slowly. It took way longer than 3 months, but in the past 3 or 4 years, I can tell you it's had a slow and very dramatic effect on me. As my inner critic softened, my own inner authority began to grow, and my shame lessened. My depression lifted, and the armor around my heart unraveled. And guess what? There was also room underneath it for something else to emerge. Me, a stronger, kinder, more empowered me. Which brings us back to the word faith. I grew more faith in myself. Finally, I befriended my critic and I rediscovered who I was. I found the soft heart behind the armor. I found that there was love at the core. Faith, to hold in one's heart, to trust, to steep in. Remember that. And remember that we can grow faith in ourselves. I thought I'd end today by describing how you can add metta practice to your life. First, spend a minute or two and ground into a comfortable seated posture in a chair or on the floor. Feel the stability in your body and begin to open up into a place of receptivity and ease. Move your awareness through your body from your scalp to your toes and soften areas of tension. Next, spend 2 or 3 minutes and bring your awareness to your breath. Anchor your awareness on each in-breath and out-breath. Notice and release the thoughts that come and go through your mind like clouds. On the in-breath, feel love coming in. On the out-breath, feel doubt exiting. Then, think of someone who loves you wholly and unconditionally. This can be a partner, child, pet, anyone of any species that sees you as the awesome, lovable person you are. And then notice in your body how this love feels. Next, repeat to yourself the intention. May I be safe. May I be happy. May I be healthy. May I be at peace. And may I be free. Move awareness into your heart and feel the energy and warmth and love fill you up. Allow this energy to expand out of you to your friends and loved ones, to your community, to the world, and to all beings. wishing yourself and everyone to be happy, safe, healthy, and at peace. Today, I still speak the metta practice 2, sometimes 3 times a day. It's one way that I turn my life into yoga. This life is hard. Yoga, the philosophy, and all the practices, not merely the postures, was invented by sages years ago to help people come back to themselves, to come back to their souls, to their jiva mukta. Since Arunachala, for me, every day is yoga. I try to stay with my breath, my body, myself as much as possible. And when I lose myself, which I eventually do, I gently remind myself to come back home. When the inner critic rears its head, and it does, these days I refuse to listen. I come back to my breath, I feel my body, and connect with the inner light that I saw on Mount Arunachala. This is my life's work. This is self-love. And when we love ourselves fully and completely, we can show up for other people in our lives too. If this sounds ridiculous, if it sounds like a lot of work, well, it is. This is yoga. Because in the end, we must take responsibility for our lives. In the end, it's you versus you, and the game is love. The ancient yogis knew that at our core, we are love. And so this too is my work, remembering that I, you, everybody, we all underneath it all are love. There's no separation. Faith is what Arunachala showed me. It showed me what is possible after hurt and anger and betrayal, after shame and self-loathing and numbing. We are whole, and we are holy. Please check out my website where you can learn about my podcast, my courses in memoir writing, free online yoga classes, and more. I'll end with the following chant. May all beings everywhere be happy and free, and may the thoughts, words, and actions of my own life contribute in some small way to that happiness and to that freedom for all. Thank you for being here today. This is Brad Wetzler, and this is the Enlightened-ishe podcast.